The early morning sun bathed the streets of Atlanta in golden light as the city slowly came to life. People bustled along the sidewalks, heading to work, grabbing coffee, or chatting with friends. The aroma of fresh bread wafted from a bakery on the corner, mixing with the scent of car exhaust from the morning traffic. The sound of honking horns, distant sirens, and casual conversation filled the air, a typical weekday morning. Among the sea of people walking with purpose was Jamal Carter, a 32-year-old black man dressed in a fitted navy blue suit with polished brown shoes. He moved with confidence, his shoulders squared, his chin up. At 6 feet 1 inch with an athletic build, he carried himself with the poise of someone who knew where he was going and what he was about. His well-groomed beard framed a strong jawline, and his deep brown eyes carried a quiet intensity. Jamal had worked hard to build the life he had. Born and raised in a lower-income neighborhood, he had faced his share of struggles, but he had always been determined. His mother, a retired nurse, instilled in him the values of hard work and perseverance. His father, a mechanic, had passed away when Jamal was a teenager, leaving him as the man of the house for his younger sister, Shanice. Despite hardships, he excelled in school, earning scholarships that eventually led him to a successful career. Now, he was a senior financial analyst at one of Atlanta's top investment firms. He wasn't just a success story. He was proof that determination and discipline could break cycles of struggle. Every morning, he followed the same routine. He stopped at Henderson's Coffee House, a small, black-owned cafe a few blocks from his office, before heading in for a long day of meetings and stock evaluations. This morning was no different, except that within the next few minutes, his entire day, and possibly his life, would take an unexpected turn. A few blocks away, Officer Brian Reynolds sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a disposable cup. At 38 years old, he had been with the Atlanta Police Department for nearly 15 years. He wasn't a bad cop, not in his own eyes. He had joined the force believing he could make a difference, that he could protect and serve. But years on the job had hardened him. Reynolds was tall and broad-shouldered, his short blonde hair neatly trimmed under his patrol cap. His deep-set blue eyes were sharp, always scanning, always assessing. He prided himself on being observant, on noticing things that others missed. That's what made him a good cop, or so he believed. He wasn't racist, not in the way some people thought, but he did believe in patterns. He had seen crime firsthand, carjackings, armed robberies, drug deals happening in broad daylight. And he had noticed something. More often than not, the suspects he arrested were young black men. He told himself it wasn't about race, it was just statistics. So, when he saw a tall black man in a sharp suit walking briskly down the street, looking over his shoulder as if checking for something, a flicker of suspicion sparked in his mind. He had seen plenty of men in nice clothes commit crimes before. A suit didn't mean innocence. His radio crackled, and a dispatch call came through. Be on the lookout for a male suspect involved in an attempted robbery near Peachtree and 5th, black male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing. Last seen heading west on Broad Street. Reynolds sat up, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. He was only a few blocks away. And then he saw Jamal Carter, a tall black man in dark clothing, walking quickly. A match. Reynolds turned on his lights and slowly rolled his patrol car toward Jamal, adrenaline already creeping into his veins. Jamal had just placed his coffee order at Henderson's when he heard the sharp wail of a police siren behind him. He instinctively turned, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the flashing blue and red lights in his periphery. He didn't think much of it, maybe an emergency somewhere nearby. Then he heard the voice. "Excuse me, sir. Stop right there." Jamal frowned as he turned fully to see a white police officer stepping out of his patrol car, one hand resting near his holster. The officer's face was unreadable, but his posture was tense. Jamal glanced around. People at the cafe were watching now, their conversation slowing. A few baristas inside exchanged uneasy glances. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jamal asked, keeping his voice calm but firm. "You match the description of a suspect involved in an attempted robbery nearby," Reynolds said, his eyes scanning Jamal's face for any signs of guilt or nervousness. Jamal felt his stomach twist. He had heard these stories before. Black men mistaken for criminals, stopped for no reason other than someone thinking they looked suspicious. And now it was happening to him. He took a slow breath. "Stay calm. Don't escalate. I think you have the wrong person, he said, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. Reynolds' hand twitched toward his gun. Keep your hands where I can see them, he barked, stepping closer. Jamal froze. The air felt heavier. The cafe had gone completely silent. For a brief moment, a dozen possible outcomes flashed through his mind. Was this going to be another one of those stories? Would his name be trending on Twitter by the end of the day for all the wrong reasons? His hand stayed up, his breath steady, but inside, he was boiling. I was just getting my morning coffee, he said through clenched teeth. Reynolds wasn't convinced. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Jamal's jaw clenched. His heart pounded in his chest as he felt cold metal press against his wrists. This wasn't happening, and yet it was. Jamal Carter stood frozen in place, his arms held firmly behind his back as Officer Brian Reynolds snapped the cold, unyielding metal cuffs around his wrists. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, not just physically, but emotionally. His entire life, he had done everything right. He had worked hard, stayed out of trouble, built a respectable career. And yet, here he was, a black man in handcuffs in broad daylight for simply existing. Around him, murmurs of shock rippled through the small crowd forming outside Henderson's coffee house. A few customers had stepped out to see what was happening, their expressions ranging from confusion to concern. Hey, that guy comes here every morning, someone called out. I saw him order coffee. He didn't do anything, another voice chimed in. Reynolds barely acknowledged the bystanders. His focus was on Jamal. You match the description of a robbery suspect, he stated flatly. Jamal swallowed back his frustration. He knew arguing wouldn't help, but every fiber of his being screamed that this was wrong. What description exactly? Jamal asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Black male, about 6 feet, dark clothing, Reynolds responded, his grip tightening on Jamal's arm. Jamal let out a humorless chuckle. That's it. He knew how flimsy that description was. It could apply to hundreds of men in the city, maybe thousands. Officer, I just walked out of a cafe, he said, trying to keep his voice level. Check the security cameras. Ask the barista. I've been here every morning for the last 2 years. But Reynolds wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. You can explain everything at the station, he said, steering Jamal toward the patrol car. Jamal's stomach turned. The station? The idea of being booked, processed, and thrown into a holding cell, even for a few hours, sent a wave of anxiety through him. Inside the patrol car, Reynolds sat in the driver's seat, glancing at Jamal through the rearview mirror. Something about this arrest felt off. The guy wasn't resisting. He wasn't shouting or causing a scene. Most of the time, when suspects got arrested, there was cursing, pleading, sometimes even running. But this guy? He just looked defeated. Still, Reynolds wasn't about to second-guess himself. He had a job to do. He had been trained to follow his instincts, and right now, his instincts told him he had the right guy. Jamal, meanwhile, sat in the back seat, his wrists aching from the too tight cuffs. He took slow, deep breaths, trying to stay calm. This is how it happens, he thought bitterly. 1 minute, you're grabbing coffee. The next, you're in a cop car because someone thinks you fit the description. He looked out the window as the city blurred past. The coffee shop, the people staring, the judgment, the assumptions. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He couldn't reach it, but he already knew who it was. His boss was expecting him in a meeting in 20 minutes. What was he supposed to say? Sorry, I got arrested for walking while black. The car ride to the precinct was silent. Jamal refused to say anything else, and Reynolds, despite the nagging feeling in his gut, didn't feel like engaging. But as they pulled up to the station, something caught his eye. Jamal's wallet had fallen slightly out of his pocket, just enough for his ID badge to be visible. Reynolds frowned as he leaned over, curiosity getting the better of him. He carefully pulled it out and turned it over in his hand. Jamal Carter, senior financial analyst, Bridges & Cole investment firm. Reynolds blinked. Wait a minute. His stomach tightened as he read it again. A senior financial analyst? Reynolds had expected some minor criminal record, maybe an outstanding warrant. But this man was a corporate professional. The pieces in Reynolds' mind started shifting, the certainty he had felt earlier beginning to waver. He glanced up at the rearview mirror, meeting Jamal's gaze for the first time. Jamal's expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, filled with something Reynolds couldn't quite place. Disappointment. Anger. Resignation. For the first time since making the arrest, Reynolds felt doubt creeping in. Had he just made a huge mistake? The car door slammed shut as Officer Brian Reynolds stepped out. He hesitated for a second, staring at the ID badge in his hand before tucking it into his pocket. He walked around the vehicle, opening the back door where Jamal sat, hands still cuffed behind his back. "Let's go," Reynolds said, his tone less forceful now. Jamal didn't move at first. He just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. He had been through situations like this before. Pulled over for no reason, followed around in stores. But this was different. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was an arrest. Taking a deep breath, Jamal finally stepped out. Inside the precinct, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The smell of stale coffee and sweat filled the air. Other officers moved through the station, processing paperwork, escorting detainees. Some barely glanced at Jamal, while others gave quick looks of curiosity. Reynolds led Jamal toward an empty holding area. The usual procedure would be fingerprinting, mugshots, and a lengthy questioning session. But something about this felt wrong now. Jamal was too calm. Most people in his position would be cursing, begging, or outright fighting the arrest. But Jamal just stood there, watching, waiting. Reynolds knew why. Jamal wasn't just mad. He was expecting this. That realization sent a small, uncomfortable shiver down Reynolds' spine. He turned away, walking toward his desk to process the paperwork, but his mind was racing. His hands hovered over the keyboard as doubt gnawed at him. What if I was wrong? He tapped the ID badge in his pocket, debating whether to take it out. That was when Officer Greg Daniels, a fellow cop Reynolds had worked with for years, sauntered over. "What you got?" Daniels asked, peering at the file on Reynolds' desk. "Picked him up outside a cafe. Matched the description of a robbery suspect," Reynolds said, his voice quieter than usual. Daniels glanced over at Jamal. "Him?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Doesn't exactly look like your typical thief." Reynolds didn't respond. Daniels leaned in slightly. "You sure about this one, man?" Reynolds clenched his jaw. Was he sure? He had been, until he saw the ID badge. Until he saw that look in Jamal's eyes. But what was he supposed to do now? He had already made the arrest. Jamal stood stiffly in the holding area, his wrists still bound. The metal cuffs dug into his skin, a dull pain that he ignored. His mind was racing through every possibility. He had seen people in his position end up in situations far worse than this. The wrong move, the wrong word. Any of it could escalate things. His phone had buzzed a few more times before the officer at the front desk confiscated it. His boss was probably calling. Maybe even his mother. And what was he supposed to tell them? "Sorry, I can't make the meeting. A cop decided I looked like a criminal today." His stomach churned at the thought. Then, suddenly, the door opened. Reynolds stepped in, eyes flicking down as if he didn't want to meet Jamal's gaze. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Reynolds cleared his throat. "I need to ask you some questions," he said. Jamal let out a slow breath. "Am I under arrest?" Reynolds hesitated. "We're still determining that," he said. Jamal narrowed his eyes. "That means you don't have anything on me," he stated, his voice sharp. Reynolds looked away. "Look, I need to make a phone call." Jamal cut him off. Reynolds ran a hand down his face. He had been trained to control situations, but this was different. The usual tactics weren't working because Jamal wasn't guilty. And the worst part? Jamal knew it. Reynolds turned toward the door, then paused. With a sigh, he reached into his pocket and pulled out Jamal's ID badge. He walked over and placed it on the small metal table in front of him. Jamal's gaze dropped to it, then lifted back to Reynolds, expression unreadable. "Senior financial analyst, huh?" Reynolds muttered. Jamal let out a humorless chuckle. "What? That surprises you." Reynolds didn't answer. Because the truth was? Yeah, it did. And that was the real problem. "You were never going to listen to me," Jamal said after a long silence. Reynolds frowned. "What are you talking about?" Jamal leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "It didn't matter what I said. You had already decided I was guilty the moment you saw me." Reynolds felt something twist in his gut. "That's not true," he shot back, but even to himself, his words felt hollow. Jamal just tilted his head slightly. "Then why am I here?" Reynolds opened his mouth, then shut it again. He had nothing. No evidence. No logical reason for keeping Jamal here. Just a gut feeling. But now, for the first time, he was questioning whether that gut feeling was actually bias. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Reynolds stood up. He walked to the door and gestured for another officer. "Take the cuffs off," he said. The officer hesitated but did as instructed. The moment the metal restraints were removed, Jamal exhaled slowly, rubbing his wrists. Reynolds turned back to him. "You're free to go." Jamal didn't move right away. "That's it?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Reynolds nodded. Jamal let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Unbelievable. He picked up his ID badge, shoving it into his pocket. He turned toward the door, but then stopped. "I want your badge number," he said. Reynolds stiffened. "Look, badge. Number." A tense silence filled the room before Reynolds finally pulled a notepad from his pocket and scribbled it down. He handed the paper to Jamal, who snatched it without another word. Then, without looking back, Jamal walked out. As Reynolds watched him go, his stomach churned. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he had been doing his job or just acting on assumptions. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could live with the answer. Jamal walked out of the police station, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. His heart was still pounding, not from fear, but from rage. This wasn't just another minor inconvenience. It was proof. Proof that no matter how successful he was, no matter how clean his record, no matter how many degrees he had or how much money he made, he was still just another suspect. He stood outside, sucking in deep breaths of the cool evening air. His phone was still locked away inside, confiscated along with his wallet when he was brought in. He needed to call someone. His boss. His lawyer. His mother. He exhaled sharply. He had done everything right, yet he had still ended up in cuffs. And the worst part? The cop who arrested him, Reynolds, had let him go like it was nothing. No apology. No explanation. Just a stiff, "You're free to go." Like his time didn't matter. Like his dignity didn't matter. Like he didn't matter. Jamal's fingers twitched at his sides. He had every right to sue. Every right to make sure Reynolds paid for this mistake. But was that enough? Would a lawsuit change anything? Or would it just be another story swept under the rug? Another news headline that people debated for a week before forgetting? His thoughts were interrupted when the station doors opened behind him. Footsteps. Jamal didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Officer Brian Reynolds. Jamal let out a humorless laugh. "What? You here to arrest me again?" he muttered. Reynolds didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked up next to Jamal, standing in silence for a moment before speaking. "I made a mistake." Jamal snorted. "You think?" Reynolds exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know you don't want to hear anything I have to say, but—" "You're right," Jamal cut in. "I don't." Another beat of silence. Then, "I was wrong." Jamal turned his head slightly, narrowing his eyes. "What?" Reynolds shifted on his feet. "Uncomfortable. I was wrong about you. About the arrest. About a lot of things." Jamal folded his arms. "What exactly were you wrong about?" he challenged. Reynolds hesitated, then met Jamal's gaze. "I saw what I wanted to see." Jamal clenched his jaw. "And what was that?" Reynolds looked away, staring at the sidewalk as if the answer were written there. A suspect. Not a man. Not a professional. Just a suspect. Jamal didn't respond right away. Because that was the problem, wasn't it? Not just with Reynolds, but with all of them. Reynolds had spent years on the force. He had prided himself on being fair, on being the type of cop who didn't let personal bias affect his work. But tonight had shattered that illusion. He hadn't arrested Jamal because the evidence pointed to him. He had arrested him because he fit the description, because he was a black man in a nice car. And that realization made Reynolds feel sick. He had always thought racism in policing was something that only bad cops did. Those officers who made headlines for brutality or corruption. But now, he was realizing something far worse. Racism didn't just come from bad cops. It came from guys like him. Guys who thought they were doing the right thing. Guys who believed they were fair until they were forced to face the truth. And that truth? He wasn't as different as he thought. Jamal's last words to Reynolds. Jamal watched Reynolds carefully, measuring his words, his body language. He could see the guilt, the discomfort. Good. It wasn't his job to make Reynolds feel better. But before he left, before he moved on, he wanted to make one thing very clear. "You don't get points for admitting you were wrong," he said finally. Reynolds looked up. "I know. Because I could have lost everything tonight," Jamal continued. "My job, my reputation, my life. All because you didn't stop to think." Reynolds swallowed hard. Jamal shook his head. "You made a mistake?" Fine. Own it. But don't expect me to forgive you just because you suddenly feel bad about it. With that, Jamal turned and walked away, leaving Reynolds standing there alone. And for the first time in his career, Officer Brian Reynolds truly understood what he had done. Jamal sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel as the events of the night replayed in his mind. He had been wrongfully arrested, humiliated, treated like a criminal despite doing nothing wrong. And now? Now he was supposed to just move on? He exhaled slowly, staring at the police station in his rearview mirror. No, he wasn't just going to let this go. He reached for his phone and dialed the first number that came to mind. It rang once, twice. Then, Jamal. His mother's voice was filled with worry, and guilt immediately tugged at his chest. He should have called her earlier. Mama, I'm fine, he assured her. I just need to talk. He told her everything. The arrest, the interrogation, the moment Reynolds saw his ID. She listened quietly, her occasional hums the only sign she was still there. When he finished, she sighed. I wish I could say I'm surprised. Jamal closed his eyes. He wished he could say the same. What are you going to do? She asked. Jamal hesitated, then said the words out loud for the first time. I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. And he meant it. Back inside the station, Reynolds sat at his desk, staring at the blank incident report in front of him. How was he supposed to write this? Pulled over an innocent man. Arrested him without real cause. Realized my own bias too late. That wasn't something that fit neatly into a police report, but it was the truth. Reynolds ran a hand down his face. He couldn't change what happened, but he could change what happened next. With a deep breath, he picked up his pen and started writing. Not just the report, but a formal request for bias training within the department. Because if he had done this to Jamal, how many others had suffered the same? And how many more would, if nothing changed? The next morning, Jamal sat in front of his laptop, typing furiously. He was writing an article, not just about his experience, but about the larger issue. About how routine traffic stops turned into wrongful arrests. About how many black men had faced worse. And as he typed, his email pinged. A message from a civil rights organization. They wanted to talk. Wanted to hear his story. Wanted to help. Jamal smiled slightly. Maybe last night had been a nightmare. But today? Today was the beginning of something bigger. As Jamal sent the email reply, he glanced out the window. The world outside looked the same as it always had. But he wasn't the same. And neither was Reynolds. Because sometimes, change didn't happen in a courtroom. Sometimes, it started with one moment of truth. One realization. One decision to be better. And that was just the beginning.